Holly Middlehurst, a woman who claims she was trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein and abused by the Duke of York, says others must be held accountable following Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction for sex abuse yesterday. Virginia Giuffre is bringing a civil case against Prince Andrew for alleged sexual assault. He denies any wrongdoing. 60-year-old Ghislaine Maxwell faces life in jail after she was found guilty of 5 out of 6 charges for helping Epstein sexually abuse girls.
These 4 women were believed, and now Ghislaine Maxwell is a convicted sex trafficker facing the rest of her life probably in prison because of the courage, the tremendous courage of these 4 women, and also the hard work of the police and the prosecutors and the attorneys who brought this case to justice.
The NHS is due to set up Nightingale Hospital surge hubs in England to prepare for increasing cases of Omicron. Work on 8 hubs holding up to 100 patients each will start this week. The NHS is also ramping up the use of virtual wards at home where patients get monitoring technology and regular check-ins with clinicians. Meanwhile, leading scientist Professor Peter Openshaw says the shortage of COVID tests is very worrying. On the same day that the UK reported more than 183,000 lab-confirmed cases, no PCR or lab flow tests were available to order online. Professor Openshaw is concerned the shortage could lead people to mixing at New Year without being able to test first. However, the shortage doesn't seem to be affecting every area of the country.
It stands in North Lincolnshire, everything is good. I know there's been some challenges around the website, but actually, I think a lot of people took stuff early. They took tests early, which of course I think there's an awful lot in people's homes. But thankfully, in North Lincolnshire, the position is very positive.
Transport now, and Southern Rail has confirmed none of its trains will run to or from London Victoria until January the 10th because of COVID-related staff shortages. It's one of the UK's busiest stations and is normally connected by Southern to locations like Brighton, Eastbourne and Portsmouth. Cross Country is also urging customers to avoid travelling on New Year's Eve because of a planned strike. A coroner has ruled the Liverpool hospital bomber died from the explosion and fire caused by the improvised device he had made with murderous intent. Iraqi-born Imad al-Swalmin was killed when the bomb he had made went off inside a taxi. The driver, David Perry, survived the blast. The explosion happened just before 11 a.m. on Remembrance Sunday. The coroner says it's still unclear whether the bomber intended to detonate the device as it exploded. The Foreign Office is seeking urgent clarification after British citizens were banned from driving through France into other countries. Non-essential travel from the UK to France has been prohibited since December to limit the spread of the Omicron variant, but several exemptions have been in place. Brits have now been told they can't travel by car across the country to homes in other parts of the European Union. And from January, insurers will no longer be able to charge existing customers more to renew than they would new customers. It follows a review by the Financial Conduct Authority that found many insurers were increasing prices for new customers in a practice known as price walking. The new rules are expected to save consumers £4.2 billion over the next 10 years. That's your update. I'm back in an hour. See you then.
Thanks, Polly. As we heard in the news, Northern Ireland and Wales are they've registered reintroducing further COVID restrictions, but from tomorrow in both places, people will be able to end the self-isolation after 7 days instead of 10, as long as they've had negative tests on day 6 and 7. It brings Northern Ireland and Wales into line with England. But of course, the isolation period remains 10 days in Scotland as further divergence emerges across the UK in response to the Omicron variant. Well, the news will be a relief to the hospitality sector. Andrew Linus is the Managing Director of Linus Food, and he told our Northern Ireland reporter Dougie Beattie that one thing his business needs at the moment is certainty.
I cover Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The difficulty I have is that is 3 different jurisdictions with 3 different COVID regulations right now. And I seem to spend my life on either Twitter or on news sites finding out what's going to happen next. So that is a real frustration of business. We've been here time and again, last March, last kind of winter, then again in January, then again in the summer. Regulations have chopped and changed, and that is very difficult for the hospitality industry. I think when I look at our 3 jurisdictions, ironically, probably Scotland has been the most helpful in terms of Nicola Sturgeon comes out and very clearly says, look, here's the plan. I may not like it, but I have more knowledge as to what's going to happen. And again, I think in Southern Ireland, we probably at least get some notice of what's going to happen down there. Unfortunately, the worst jurisdiction has been the Northern Ireland Executive. It's the not knowing is the hardest part for us as businesses. They don't understand that hospitality has a supply chain behind that, be it food, drink, whatever, fresh veg, fresh food. And we have to try and plan. And without any kind of level of guidance or thought process, that is very, very difficult. Throughout this pandemic, we haven't even had rates relief in our business as a food wholesaler. From all of those lockdowns, the amount of lost stock is in the tens of thousands of pounds for us as a business. And the view has been, well, that's a too difficult box to tick, so we just have to deal with that.
That was Andrew Linus speaking to GBNews a little earlier. Well, the latest figures from the Zoe COVID study suggest that 3/4 of people who suffered common cold symptoms over the past week have actually had COVID. Dr. Claire Steeves, a scientist on the study, has urged the government to add symptoms such as a sore throat, headache and runny nose to its official list of COVID symptoms as soon as possible. Previous symptoms such as fever, new continuous cough and loss of sense of smell or taste are now much less common. Meanwhile, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, has told MPs that the government will treble the supply of lateral flow tests from 100 million to 300 million in January and February in response to current demands. People have struggled to access to supplies at pharmacies and the NHS website since the time you have to spend in isolation in England was cut from 10 days to 7 last week. However, Mr Javid has also warned there will be further supply issues in the short term over the next couple of weeks. Let's move away from coronavirus now. 92 convicted terrorists are being considered for release from prison by the Parole Board. These inmates, who were often participated in plots that failed only through the intervention of the security services. Terror offenders must now serve at least 2/3 of the sentence before being eligible for release. Well, Sir Mark Lyle Grant, who's a former UK ambassador to the United Nations and a former national security advisor, has explained why so many convicted terrorists are being considered for parole.
Well, I think this is a sign, actually, that the new system is working, because before the legislation that you mentioned that was introduced in February 2020, some of these terrorists would have already been released automatically after serving only half of their sentence. But over the last 2 years, they now have to serve at least 2/3 of their sentence and then could be eligible to have a hearing before the Parole Board. So I don't think it's surprising that there are a number in the pipeline. Over the last 4 years, there have been about between 200 and 250 convicted terrorists in British jails at any one time. And that number has remained largely constant over that period. The large majority of those are Islamist terrorists, although there is a rising number of right-wing extremists in prison as well. And over the last 2 years, since this new legislation has passed, about 110 to 115 of those have been presented before the Parole Board. But of those, only 11, so less than 10%, have actually been released. The rest have either been sent back to prison or are waiting for their hearings to be heard.
Victims have been expressing their relief at the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell of charges of recruiting and trafficking young girls to be sexually abused by the late American financier Jeffrey Epstein. The 60-year-old was found guilty on 5 of the 6 counts she faced, including the most serious charge, that of sex trafficking a minor. Well, earlier, Colin Brazier was joined in the studio by political commentator Benedict Spence. He explained why the British media have been drawn by this story.
All facets of the story. It's got something for everybody, links to sort of American high society, British high society, the royal family. There are, links to, Jeffrey Epstein was friends with everybody. Ghislaine Maxwell knew everybody. And it is fascinating, isn't it, that as much as we're talking about Ghislaine, this sort of very accomplished woman, this very personable woman, actually throughout the trial, it's the spectre of Jeffrey Epstein himself has sort of hung over it. There's been this sort of feeling that as much as she is on trial, this is as much his trial as anything else, because, of course, justice has been denied to the victims. I wouldn't say to Jeffrey Epstein himself. I don't think death is escaping justice, but certainly in terms of what his victims would have wanted, that was a very unsatisfactory outcome. So that, I think, has intensified all the interest into this trial. I thought it was very interesting. The Times have run a good piece on this, where they pointed out that Ghislaine Maxwell's father, when he was still Jan Huk rather than Robert Maxwell, when he was still in Czechoslovakia during the Second World War, he was tried by the Nazis for espionage, but he escaped on his way to court. But no such sort of escape for Ghislaine Maxwell, as harsh a sentence as you could possibly imagine. Whether or not she serves all 65 years or whether or not they are sort of combined and run concurrently is yet to be seen. But nonetheless, it's something, again, to use a cliche, it has gripped people's attention, because these sort of stories, they don't come along that often. And it is always people like that that sort of pull the most focus.
The former American President, George W. Bush, who was responsible for ordering the war on terror and deploying troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, has admitted he knew very little about international affairs. Official documents released today reveal that President Bush, who at the time was the governor of Texas, made his admission to the former British ambassador to the United States, Sir Christopher Maher, in February 1998, prior to the Republicans' presidential run. Well, Sir Christopher joined Colin Brazier on GBNews earlier and suggested we can sometimes overestimate how prepared politicians are when they get the top job.
I'm not at all surprised to hear that a governor of Texas didn't know much about the wider world. And not at all surprised that somebody who eventually became President of the United States, and that was 3 years later after this meeting, didn't know anything really significant about the world at that time. And I have to say that a year later, when I returned to Texas to see Governor George W. Bush again, he had by then just about decided to declare his run for the presidency and had created a kind of brains trust of mighty experts on foreign policy to give him teachings on the various issues around the world. 3 years later, when Tony Blair paid his first visit to the United States to meet George W. Bush as president at Camp David, the president's retreat, George W. Bush seemed pretty well versed in issues dealing, for example, with the Middle East and Russia. This notion that he came into the presidency with, that it was America's destiny. I mean, so many other presidents think the same way. It was America's destiny to spread democratic values, values of freedom and liberty, and essentially American values around the world. All that stuff was supercharged, turbocharged by 9/11 and his reaction to it. That he, in effect, became, if you like, God's instrument to rid the world of terrorism and the threat to democracy. And that, I think, was the most important factor in his deciding to invade Iraq in 2003. And Tony Blair found it extremely persuasive as well, as we all know.
I think also Christopher Miller speaking to Colin Brazier a little bit earlier, just to say we've got the figures in hospitalisations in England, 11,452, up 61% from a week earlier, the highest since February 26th in England, just come through in the last couple of minutes. OK, we'll have the top news stories back at 6 o'clock. Don't forget Nigel's here at 7. Up next, though, it's difficult conversations after the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Exceptionally mild as we approach 2022 for New Year's Eve. Most of the rain will wane, it will fade, but it is going to be a windy one. Now, all courtesy of an area of low pressure, which is still with us, delivering cloud, rain and stronger winds as we head through the next 24 hours and also beyond. This weather front here stalls across more central and northern parts of the country as we head through this evening and overnight, with some high rainfall totals for the Lake District as well as Dumfries and Galloway, and some moderate bursts to come through the evening and overnight for Northern Ireland, with showers to follow. And then rain returns to Wales and the West Country. A strong wind associated with this, and this wet weather by tomorrow morning will be sitting across central southern England and the Midlands, clearing quite quickly towards the southeast. And that bodes well for England and Wales through the day on New Year's Eve.